two things interrelated that we've got to deal with. One is our anemic productivity growth. And I know you've heard luncheon speeches before about how we need to raise productivity in this country, but just because you've heard it before doesn't mean it's not true. We, in the last 5-6 years, were 22nd out of 29 OECD countries in productivity growth. So we're not just falling behind the Americans. We're falling behind the Dutch. We're falling behind the Norwegians. We're falling behind the Icelandic, the Irish. We used to think of ourselves as being, second or third in the world rankings and standard of living. We're slipping. We're down to 7th or 8th, even with our abundant oil wealth. So that's, you might say, well, relative decline, we can handle that. Who cares? We're not the richest country anymore. So let me put it this way. We need to raise our productivity not just to try to keep pace with the Joneses, but because we've got a demographic challenge coming at us like we don't even have reckoned with. You might have heard, for example, that the Canada Pension Plan had been fixed. Remember 10 years ago, the finance ministers of the country got together and they jacked up contributions by 76%, and they fixed the Canada Pension Plan. No, they did not. What they did was avert immediate crisis. We remain, put the CPP and the Quebec Pension Plan together, there remains an unfunded liability in excess of $800 billion in the Canada and Quebec pension plans. We have a healthcare system that is expensive nowadays. You ain't seen nothing yet. When you add in the costs of treating the future elderly, which would include me and most of the people in this room, Bill Robson of the C.D. Howe Institute has calculated an unfunded liability in terms of those healthcare costs on the order of $1.3 trillion. And then there's the good old national debt. Add the provinces and the federal together, about $700-odd billion. So you've got an accumulated unfunded liability facing us of $2.4 trillion. And what that means for future generations is, of course, is much higher tax burdens than we have now, much higher, on the order of 5-6% of GDP. That's more than all the provincial income taxes combined. Well, one of two things is going to happen. Either those rates are going to go up, in which case they're going to face a staggering burden, and it's going to take a toll on productivity growth, and we're going to grind the economy into the ground. Or they're going to say, to hell with it, we're not paying for you. And as a future old person, I'm not happy about that prospect. So the good news is there is an answer to this, and the answer is start now to raise our productivity growth. Even if you only raise it 0.5 percentage point per year, you compound that, and you're in the insurance business, you know all about compounding. If you compound that over 50 years, that's major growth. It means they're that much richer, means they can pay for our health care and our pensions much more easily. They can bear that burden without having to have those kinds of high tax rates. So it's an entirely predictable problem. It's not going to take us by surprise. We can deal with it if we start now. Is anybody talking about the productivity agenda? No, they're not. There are some good policy ideas here and there in the party's platforms. We had this weird thing come out by the back door via the Globe and Mail's London bureau that we're going to have a free trade treaty, apparently. They're about to embark on negotiations with the European Union. They're going to start the negotiations 3 days after the election. It'd be nice to be talking about that during the election so that people can't say, well, we never heard about this. It'd be nice to be talking about what else we can do to expand trade, to expand our openness to foreign investment, for example, because if we really want to raise productivity, one of the things we have to do is give our workers more capital. We've been relying on a labor force growth, essentially cheap labor strategy until now. If we want to reverse that, we've got to start having more capital per worker. That means more investment. We're not going to be able to produce it all at home since we've got record low household savings rates. We're going to need foreign capital to do that. Are we talking about that in any serious way in this election? No, we are not. And the other big issue that supposedly was going to define this election was the environment, the global warming challenge. Again, a long-run thing that if you start now doesn't have to be a disaster. It can be an entirely manageable problem. And between liberal incompetence and Tory demagoguery, we seem to have battered that issue into the ground. We may still do something. I don't know. We'll probably be dragged into it by the international community, and maybe that's where the public's mind is at. Canadians, like to tell pollsters that we're very concerned about the future of the world. Something should definitely be done, but somebody else should pay for it. And the Tories, I think, correctly intuited that the public are essentially phonies on this issue, And they've produced their own phony platform on it, which they don't like to talk about. What they like to talk about is the liberal, risky scheme to put a permanent tax on everything, as it's called in Toryland. Well, let's compare those two plans. The Liberals would put a carbon tax that would start at $10 per ton of carbon and rise to $40 and beyond in outward years, but $40 after 4 years. So the Tories have had a great fun bashing that. The Tory plan, which they don't talk about, but which they used to talk about when they want everyone to know they had a plan, if you actually dig into it, you've got to ask a lot of people and dig into it, but what you find is it would involve, as many of you may know, a cap-and-trade system, a system of tradable emissions credits. It's a perfectly valid way of approaching it. Carbon tax, cap-and-trade, they amount to the same thing ultimately. Well, no one really knows what would be the cost of those credits on the market. This is one of the differences. With the Liberal plan, you have a certainty about what the cost is going to be. You're not quite as sure about how much emissions you're going to reduce. The Tory plan, you've got certainty on the emissions because they're going to set them by fiat, but you don't really know what the cost of the credits that will result from the supply and demand in the marketplace will be. But the forecast is it would start at about $20 a ton and rise to $60 a ton. So 10 to 40 over 4 years, 20 over to 60 over about 8 years. Not a huge real difference in the cost of the two plans. And yet the Tories have been able to kind of hit this sweet spot of convincing people without actually saying it that the choice is between a really costly plan and, well, they don't actually say no cost, but they imply it. If you ask them, they'll say, oh, no, we have a plan, but you have to ask them. The Liberals, on the other hand, who might have made this a defining issue, might have made this kind of game changer that they hoped, I think muffed it because the plan, as you know, was supposed to be a green shift. It wasn't just a carbon tax. It was a green shift. We're going to raise the tax on carbon. We're going to cut the taxes on income taxes. Great idea. Totally in favor of it. The trouble was they didn't actually do it, or not the way they said they would. They're going to raise carbon taxes by $40 billion over 4 years. And as Stephen Harper was quite right to say last night in the debates, they're only actually going to give you honest-to-goodness tax cuts of $26 billion. And when you actually work that through, that's $26 billion, remember, over nearly $1 trillion of a budget over 4 years. It actually adds up to a 1 percentage point cut in tax rates. Well, 1 percentage point is not going to turn us into the northern tiger. It's not going to make a huge economics difference. It's better than nothing, but it's not going to make a huge difference. It certainly isn't going to make a difference politically. And the misjudgment I think they made was, on the one side, you've got let's save the world. Right? It's a very idealistic proposal because, of course, Canada alone is not going to save the world. We are 2% of the world's emissions. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it means we're setting a good example. We're being good world citizens. We're doing something very idealistic, very altruistic. Well, it's hard to square that kind of appeal, and it's a potent appeal to some voters. It's hard to square that with, but it's not going to really cost you anything, and we're going to provide you a little calculator so you can figure out that your family will not have to pay a penny, and if you are paying a penny, we'll give you a subsidy to make sure you don't actually have to bear any burden. And they had to add in more and more and more subsidies as more of their caucus complained about this. And they essentially yielded the turf to the Tories, because the Tories could say, carbon tax, booga booga, you will pay more, risky tax and everything. The income tax is somewhere off in the distance. You'll fill out your form and you'll have to qualify for it, and it's very abstract. And I think if you put it on that playing field, you're not going to win. What they needed on the tax cut side was something equally exciting, something equally world-beating, something equally headline-grabbing. They needed really deep cuts in tax rates, the kind that would really supercharge investment in this country, really get us on the road to being a northern tiger. But that would have meant that they didn't have the revenues that they wanted to do to play to traditional Liberal constituencies. And the old pros in the party prevailed upon them that that's what they needed to do. So I think the long and the short of that was the tax cut part of it has been completely forgotten with the willing assistance of the Tories. And, by the way, with the willing assistance of the NDP. It's been very interesting. The NDP and the Tories have been very strange bedfellows all through this campaign. You know, they were on the same side of whether the Greens should be in the debates. They have essentially the same environmental platform. And as Stephen Gordon, the economist, has put it, you know, what the Tories and the NDP are both doing is saying, we're just going to tax the big polluters, and they'll pay, and they won't pass the cost on to you. So as Stephen Gordon, the economist, has put it, it's an alliance there between those who have a visceral hatred of taxes, the Tories, and those who have a visceral hatred of corporations. And you put the two together, and we won't tax you. We'll just make those big polluters pay. It's extremely cynical, but they've been able to get away with it with the willing connivance of my friends in the media. And let me just close by talking a little bit about what a mess this election has been on so many fronts. And one in particular has been the role of my own industry. Politicians at least sometimes learn from their mistakes. We in the press and the electronic media, we go out election after election and we repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And we're having a measurably harmful effect on democracy as a result. We always say we're never going to do that again. After every election, when we've been led by the nose and fed our Gainsburgers by the traveling circus of the political parties, and we indulge in the photo ops, and we tell people what the name of the campaign plane was, and we go to the photo op at the factory where it turns out the president of the factory is not supporting the party, and ho, 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 isn't that a surprise? And we run 3 or 4 polls every day. So we tell you over and over and over again who's ahead and, of course, who's behind. And then we get the person who's behind on the TV, and the only thing we want to interview them about is, why are you behind? Why are you a loser? Why can't you do better? It's like an endless repetition of the same question over and over again. I think the plan is to see if we can make them cry. But of course, and we delve deeply into the strategy and the tactics, and we interview the backroom boys, and we want to know what's your next move, because it's endlessly fascinating to the backroom boys. It's endlessly fascinating to people in politics. And it's endlessly fascinating to us because they're endlessly fascinating to us, because we wish we were players like they were. They're in the room, we're standing outside taking notes, and it eats away at us. So we're besotted with them. We've got a total crush on the strategists. But Mr. and Mrs. Canada, I submit, is not quite as fascinated by that. Some portion of the readership is. They want to read some part of the coverage, but not nearly as much as we give them. Most people, most voters, most readers, I think what they would really like to know is, who are these people who are running, and what are they going to do to us? We need to tell them much more about the character and values of the people who are running and about the policies that they would implement or would not implement. We need to make much more of the focus on that. I'm not sure we can, because I'm not sure the incentive system facing us as media people is going to ever actually produce that. We've got a lot of time to fill. You can only tell people so much about a platform, et cetera, and so we endless, and it's just too exciting to get into the horse race coverage. I think we need to change the structure of the way we run elections, and one particular suggestion I would make is to fix the mess we have made of the TV debates. It is scandalous that we have one debate in each language. To be President of the United States, just to get the nomination of your party, you've got to debate 60, 70 times. When you get in the presidential season, there's 3 presidential debates, 1 vice presidential debate. And that's after an 18-month campaign when you've every opportunity to learn. It's exhaustively covered. We had this very brief window, 5 weeks, 6 weeks election campaigns. Is it so hard to think that we could have a debate every week of the campaign, where you could have a debate about the economy, a whole debate about the economy, a whole debate about foreign policy, where you could experiment with different formats and find which one works, but where the structure of the campaign would be built around these weekly events, which would give us in the media lots to talk about, but something substantive to talk about. I mean, you can only rehash it. I mean, inevitably the next day it's who won, who lost, and that's a bit of a bore. But once you get through that, there'll be policy things, presumably. This would be an opportunity, as we saw sort of Dion take advantage of the French debate, be an opportunity to roll out policies as part of these debates. I think it would materially change the way in which the conversation was conducted. It would certainly change the incentive system for the media to some extent, and I think we'd get better campaigns out of it. The other thing I would say is make them in English and French together. First hour English, second hour French, whatever. This notion of having a segregated debate that's only in French, if you watch it, it's not a French debate, it's a Quebec debate. It's an entire debate on one province. An important province, no doubt. A more important province than Ontario, more important region than the West, I don't know. But it's a pander fest is what it is. We need to have debates in which the whole country is watching together, where you can't get away with that as a leader, where everyone, you know that you have to speak to the whole country. The final point I would make is, as a big picture thing, I think we need to change the way we run elections. We need to change the electoral system. You look at the Green Party, I'm amazed that people would vote for the Green Party, not because they're not worthy of support, but because the 600,000 people who voted for them last time, the 1.5 million people who on present polls would vote for them this time, will go to the polls, cast their ballot, knowing they're not going to elect anybody. 1.5 million voters, and they may not elect a single MP. And that's only one of the many distortions built into our system. The Bloc Québécois, with 1.2 million voters, let's say, might elect 50 MPs. There is something deeply wrong about that. But more importantly, there's something deeply wrong about a structure of incentives, again, within the political system, in our highly leveraged first-past-the-post system. When a 2% swing in the vote typically will give you a 60-seat swing in your parliamentary representation. You're making huge bets, in other words. Well, two things result of that. One is, in the normal course of things, the parties become horribly risk-averse. If you're living on that kind of knife edge, you're desperate not to lose that 2% of vote. That could really cost you. So what we get is long periods of centrist monotony when nobody's taking any risks, nobody's taking any departures. It's just the same old, same old. Then comes the election time. Well, now what you're thinking is, maybe I can gain 2%. I don't want to take any big risk, but maybe with the right little kind of wedge issue, nothing significant, but a kind of symbolic trinket for this or that demographic group amongst those swing voters, maybe I can pull them my way. So at election time, I'll throw out these kind of meaningless issues that will swing the vote one way or another. And then if you do and you win, then you get this wild swing in the parliamentary representation. In Ontario, for example, we went from NDP to radical conservatives to liberals, all in the space of about 5 years. 10 years. But these kinds of wild swings based on phony mandates, not based on actual, massive change in what the electorate was thinking about these issues, but just on the vagaries, the bets of this highly leveraged system. I think there are perverse incentives built into that. I think it would be much, whereas if you had a 2% swing in the vote means a 2% swing in your representation, then everyone calms down. You're not living on a knife edge anymore. You're engaged in the daily job of persuading people, and you make incremental gains by persuading people to your point of view. It makes room for more points of view. You'd have, as you have in European countries, 5 or 7 parties with a distribution of views rather than the sort of accidental things that we have right now. You might get an honest-to-goodness free market party in there in the mix, for example. It's mystifying to me why so many small C conservatives find this idea abhorrent, because if they look at what the Conservative Party has become, I think this is the only way in which you're going to get a renewed entrance into the marketplace, the political marketplace, of actual honest-to-goodness free market ideas. But the left, I think, should also be looking at it with intrigue. Everyone's talking about don't split the vote on the left. For God's sakes, don't vote Green because you're going to split the vote from the NDP, or don't vote NDP because you're going to split the vote from the Liberals. For God's sakes, don't vote for the party that you actually support. Whereas in a system where it's not splitting the vote, but it's adding the votes, where if you get 3 parties who are willing to form a coalition with each other because they have a reasonable overlap in their points of view, then each of them can present their platforms, they can find the common ground, they can form a governing coalition, and their voters can vote in good conscience for parties they actually support rather than the least objectionable one. I'll leave on that note, I guess, as a sort of a big picture question, but I'd be happy to take any questions you might have about this election, or I suppose I never did say anything about the American election, if you have any thoughts about that as well. So I'm happy to take questions.
Andrew, so far in this conference, I'm batting 0 for 3, so we'll see what happens on number 4. About 10 days ago, Premier McGuinty had a breakfast in Toronto and started to talk about, I guess, his version of the equalization debate. I think the intent, although I'm not sure what the intent was, I think the intent was to try to grab some leverage or some traction for that argument in the context of the election. He wasn't being partisan. I'm wondering if you would have any particular observations on either what he was doing or how successful it has or hasn't been.
It's been too successful in some ways for my liking. I think we have to separate a couple of things. The province of Ontario, I suppose, has had a legitimate beef about the structure of equalization over the years, because it is true that Ontario taxpayers have been paying in, not the government of Ontario. People sometimes think, or the rhetoric will lead people to believe that it's the governments of the provinces that are contributing into the equalization pool. Of course, it isn't. It's the taxpayers. And it has been a one-way flow into other provinces. Now, if it were an otherwise well-designed system, that most people would say would be part of the Confederation deal, but they've had a legitimate beef in that it's been a very poorly designed system that has had, again, all kinds of perverse incentives that, particularly when, if you got $1 more in revenue growth in the province, you got that dollar taken away in equalization payments. Effectively, it's the welfare trap writ large. But it seems to me the people who really had a beef about that were the people in the Atlantic provinces, because they were the ones who were really suffering from that, though you'd hardly get politicians in that region to admit it, at least not publicly. There's been some movement, and there's been some attempts to try to reform the system. It's been bedeviled by the particularities of our revenue system with the distribution of resource revenues across the country, and I really don't want to get into a discussion of that, because there's only 6 people who actually understand the equalization system in this country, and I'm not really one of them. I understand half of it, let's say. But I think he's had a legitimate beef to that extent about the structure of the equalization system. What he has not had a legitimate beef, but what he's had absolute, I think, very good political success, if only for domestic consumption, is in this so-called fiscal gap, where you add up everything that the federal government spends in Ontario, you add up everything that the taxpayers put in, and you take the difference and you say, aha, we're being shortchanged. Well, no, it's mostly, historically, it's been because Ontario has historically been richer than other provinces, so naturally they're going to pay more in than other provinces do. Mr. McGuinty is working hard to change that, I grant you, and he has made his contribution to holding back the Ontario economy. I think and so the gap, as I understand it, has now shrunk from $28 billion to $11 billion. But he's been able to demagogue that issue to what particular extent? He's been able to winkle a few billion out of the feds in the last little while. If you actually look, transfers to Ontario have actually grown rather rapidly in recent years, despite all his complaints, or because of all his complaints. And most of the spending growth that he's been able to indulge in has essentially been courtesy of the feds. But in that, he's simply playing a game he's learned very well from Quebec. Quebec was able to invent this issue of the fiscal imbalance. They all have their words that they give it. The provinces are always inventing these new principles to justify what is essentially an unchanging argument, which is more. And so in Quebec, it's called the fiscal imbalance. In Ontario, it's called something else. The West is its own thing. And so the Harper Conservatives gave Quebec several $billion in the name of fixing this mythical fiscal imbalance, along with, of course, the Nation Resolution and UNESCO and several other things. And, of course, this had solved the Quebec problem. So where are we? The Bloc is going to get 40% of the vote in this election. Charest is sounding more nationalist now than any previous Quebec premier. He's got 2 parties that are out-nationalisting him. We think we're out of the woods because they're not actually calling for a referendum, but why would they? They're getting everything they need without having a referendum. So we have not solved the Quebec problem. We've temporarily, assuaged by giving away stuff, but you can only do that so far, and even Stephen Harper at some point is going to run into the limits of that strategy. That's probably too long an answer.
With regard to your comments changing the electoral system, at the risk of betraying my total ignorance here, I don't even understand it. So how do you get past that? Because I suspect that's the biggest barrier, is we as Canadians just simply don't understand it. And how would you resolve that?
We had a disgraceful exercise recently on Ontario that was supposedly a referendum, but where polls showed most people didn't even know the referendum was on until about 2 weeks before it, in which, again, the media did an absolutely abysmal job of explaining the issues, et cetera. There was a much more exciting and interesting exercise that happened in BC last year, or 2 years ago, I guess. And they're going to repeat the exercise in 2009. They got 58% of the vote last time in favor of changing the electoral system. It's a remarkable outcome. And we'll see whether they're able to get over the 60% hump that they need to get. They got, by the way, they got a majority of the vote in 77 out of 70, or 75 out of 77 ridings in BC. And the system I favor in BC is the BC system is the one I favor. You'll get people saying that it's complicated. Here's how complicated it is. Instead of marking an X, you vote 1, 2, 3. You rank your candidates in order of preference. The counting part of it is complicated, I grant you. The voting part is dead simple. I don't know how to fix my car, but I know how to drive one. I don't know how the engine works, but I know how to turn the wheel. And the voters are driving the system. So if we can get that system, if we can get it through in BC, BC will be the battleground. If it falls in BC, I will have to admit, after Ontario and after Quebec and PEI, it probably won't happen in my lifetime. If it passes in BC, I think it will squarely be on the national agenda because it will no longer be some risky, untried, vaguely foreign system, or more than vaguely foreign. It'll be status quo in part of the country, and we'll be able to learn from that experience. And I think it'll be hard to ignore. Certainly, if we get a hung parliament where the Greens have balance of power, who knows? Because the Greens are certainly squarely for it. So it may well be coming. We'll have to see. BC will tell the tale.
Andrew, can I just ask you to make one comment, if you would, or a brief comment on any observations that you may have had on the U.S. Did you even get a chance to look at the U.S. debate last night? Could you make just an observation or two?
I only saw clips of it, so I'd be hard pressed. It seems like Sarah Palin was able to come back somewhat from the fiasco of the interviews. She successfully managed expectations down, you might say. But it's a sorry situation with the problems the Americans are facing, that they would have not one but two very inexperienced candidates running for president or VP. Now, I am an admirer of Barack Obama. So I think he's an extraordinary talent, and I've been impressed by many of the things he's been able to say. But by most accounts, he would be thought extraordinarily inexperienced for the job that he's going to face. I mean, JFK, when he came in, was thought to be a callow youth. He'd been in Congress for 14 years. So it's distressing that the Americans have come to that situation. I think, however, if you look at this monsoon that's come through in the form of the financial turmoil in the middle of this campaign, I think that's more or less decided. I cannot see McCain recovering from that. It has changed people's calculus, that they are so focused now on how do we get out of this mess, who got us into it in the first place, but how do we get out of it, that I think that and the legitimate doubts people have about putting a 72-year-old in power with somebody so inexperienced and not hugely impressive beyond that. I mean, she's a natural political talent, no doubt. She's a wonderful communicator. And if she were just, launching her campaign, if we were 2 years before the election, she might be a candidate to watch because she'd have those 2 years to learn the ropes. But to be thrown in the midst of this, to be fair to her, I mean, any of us could handle that? And she's handled it much better certainly than I could have in that situation. But she's not qualified to be president of the United States, and I think a lot of voters understand that. And as I say, given the actuarial tables, it's my only pander to my audience.
Can we show our appreciation to a fantastic presentation? You can sit down and I'll thank you while you're eating, okay?
Okay, thank you.
I want to allow Andrew to sit down and at least start eating before I thank him. But you're going to think I'm pretty fickle, you people who were here last year, because last year when Frank McKenna spoke to us at this same luncheon, my question to him was, why didn't he run for the head of the Liberal Party, because he was one of the most popular Liberal candidates in the country, and you remember what his answer to me was, perhaps. But when I hear Andrew speak,